My mother-in-law wants to force my son to dress like a girl because she's chasing modernity, but someone discovers a World War II collection in her house and she faces cancellation. It all started pretty normally. My relationship with my mother-in-law had always been cordial. She was never a difficult woman, and while there was always that natural discomfort that can arise between a son-in-law and his mother-in-law, we never had serious problems. My father-in-law, on the other hand, was a great guy. Although we weren't the best of friends, he was always a respectable figure, and we never had conflicts. In fact, until he passed away a year ago, my life with my wife, my son, and her family went on without much drama. The death of my father-in-law hit everyone hard, but especially my mother-in-law. She fell into a deep depression. My wife and I did our best to support her during that time. We knew it was going to be a long process. My wife visited her mother often, we brought her food, and we invited her to our home so she wouldn't feel so alone. But it was clear she had to go through that mourning process, and there wasn't much we could do beyond being there for her. What we didn't expect was that when she finally started coming out of that mourning phase, she would do so in such a radical way. The change was, honestly, bewildering. She went from being a woman who lived a quiet life, where her main activities were watching her favorite soap operas, going for weekend walks, and working, to becoming a woman obsessed with her new modern life. At first, it wasn't that much of a problem. My wife and I were happy that she had regained some of her energy and started going out, socializing, and doing new things. But quickly, this modernity became something uncomfortable. To start, my mother-in-law created an Instagram account. That was fine. Many older people have social media accounts. But what became uncomfortable was the type of photos she started posting. Photos that left little to the imagination, and that were clearly not appropriate for a woman her age, or at least not photos you'd want to see of your own mother-in-law. The worst part wasn't just that she had the account, but that every time we saw her, she insisted on showing us the new pictures she had posted, as if she were showing us vacation photos or something innocent. It was awkward. Honestly, I don't think even my wife wanted to see those images of her mother. Then, my mother-in-law started going on dates. At first, as I mentioned, we were happy. We were glad she wanted to move on with her life after my father-in-law's death. But even that got weird fast. My mother-in-law spoke openly about her dates, with details no one, not even her daughter, wanted to hear. There were sexual details, things I definitely didn't care to know. So whenever I sensed the conversation going in that direction, I found a way to disappear. There was always some repair around the house that needed doing as far away from my mother-in-law as possible, so I wouldn't accidentally overhear anything. Sadly, my wife wasn't as lucky, and she was forced to listen to things no one wants to hear from their own mother. But the change didn't stop there. My mother-in-law also started becoming extremely radical in her ideas. She began posting on her social media about political issues, especially criticizing men. If a man took her out to dinner and ordered meat, she openly criticized him for it in her posts. If her dates didn't share her political views, she blocked them immediately and spoke badly about them on her platforms. To her, men were the root of all problems. And although she preached equality between men and women, there was a constant contradiction in her discourse. For example, she demanded that her dates pay for dinner, even though she preached that women should be equal in every way. It was confusing, but my wife and I tolerated it because, honestly, it wasn't something that directly affected our lives. Oddly enough, at least she didn't attack me. Or at least, not directly or on social media. Once, she tried to bring her political conversations into our home, but both my wife and I made it clear that we didn't want to talk politics. That was our rule at home. No politics. We believe that everyone is free to think and vote as they wish, but discussions on those topics only lead to unnecessary fights. Surprisingly, my mother-in-law seemed to understand and dropped the subject, at least in our presence. What was most alarming was that she began hanging out with people who shared her new radical worldview, women with the same ideas and attitudes, which only exacerbated her behavior. My wife and I started distancing ourselves a bit from her regarding these conversations, but everything came to a head at our son's birthday party. For his 7th birthday, we organized a typical children's party. Nothing too fancy, just some school friends, games, theme decorations, and a few parents of the invited kids. Our son had chosen a dinosaur theme because, at the time, he was obsessed with them. You know how kids are. One week they love dinosaurs, and the next, they've moved on to something else. But at that moment, dinosaurs were his passion, so we decorated the entire backyard with that theme. Everything was going fine until my mother-in-law arrived. The first thing she did upon seeing the decorations was complain. She told us we were trying to instill traditional values in our son, and that we should let him explore other interests. To her, the dinosaur theme was an imposition. We tried explaining that our son had chosen the theme, but she didn't understand. In fact, she even attempted to start taking down the decorations. Thankfully, my wife saw her and stopped her. She told her that if she didn't stop, she would kick her out of the party. That calmed her down for a bit, but it was clear she wasn't going to let things go. Shortly afterward, my mother-in-law remembered that she had left the presents in her car, so she went to get them. When she came back, things got even weirder. The gifts weren't the typical toys or games you'd expect at a child's birthday party. No, what she brought were several dresses in my son's size, and she announced that it would be fun for him and some of his friends to try them on to explore other styles. She also suggested that it would be perfect to take a group photo of all of them wearing the dresses. My wife and I looked at each other, and we firmly told her no. The kids were already having fun and had no interest in changing clothes. But my mother-in-law didn't give up. She went straight to my son and asked if he'd like to try on one of the dresses. My son, like any 7-year-old boy, said no, that those were dresses for girls. At that moment, my mother-in-law lost control. She started yelling at my son, telling him he was being sexist for thinking that boys couldn't wear dresses, and that we had instilled those backward values in him. My son, obviously scared and confused, began to cry. But it didn't stop there. My mother-in-law also started yelling at the other children, telling them that they, too, were victims of their parents' prejudices. At that point, the other parents began to gather to see what was happening. And instead of calming down, my mother-in-law started attacking them as well, accusing them of being just as backward and not allowing their children to explore their true identities. The most ironic part of all of this is that one of the couples present was a gay couple. Even they, who live diversity in their own family life, were offended by my mother-in-law's insistence on forcing the kids to wear dresses. They explained that their son was free to choose whatever he wanted to wear, and he preferred boys' clothes. He even liked dinosaurs too. Things escalated even further when my mother-in-law, completely out of line, asked the gay parents if they were gay enough, because if they were, they would allow their son to wear a girl's dress. The parents, understandably upset, pulled their son away from the scene and tried to calm things down, but my mother-in-law wouldn't stop. She kept shouting, demanding that the kids put on the dresses. That's when my wife and I decided it was time to put an end to it. We asked my mother-in-law to calm down, stop ruining the party, and leave. There was no room for that kind of argument at a children's birthday party. But instead of leaving, my mother-in-law physically attacked one of the gay dads. She threw a punch that, for a woman over 60, was surprisingly strong. Everyone panicked. My wife and I managed to separate her, but we knew the situation had completely spiraled out of control. We called the police because it was clear we couldn't handle this on our own. While we waited, we brought her inside the house and tried to calm her down by offering her something to drink. We knew that if she left before the police arrived, she likely wouldn't face immediate consequences, but after everything she had done, we weren't willing to let her leave that easily. The police arrived shortly after, and my mother-in-law was arrested. The father who had been attacked was determined to press charges, and we didn't blame him. My mother-in-law was released on bail a few days later, paid by one of her new radical friends. The father is going ahead with the charges, and we know that's the right thing to do. What I'm now wondering is if we went too far by keeping her at the house until the police arrived. Should we have let her leave and dealt with the consequences later? Were we cruel in setting that trap for her? Edit. It's not like we physically restrained her. We just kept her occupied until the police arrived. It was a kind of trap. But even if we hadn't done that, we don't know if she would have wanted to leave on her own anyway. Update 1. After explaining that we didn't physically restrain her, but only distracted her until the police arrived, most people here agreed that we're not the villains in this situation. It's interesting because, looking back, aside from a few minor incidents that never escalated, my mother-in-law had never shown such extreme behavior before the birthday party. She had always been somewhat eccentric, especially after my father-in-law's death, but nothing that seriously affected our relationship or made us think things could reach the level they did that day. However, her radicalization seemed to have accelerated considerably in the months leading up to the party. In fact, we barely had any contact with her in the month before the birthday, which might have contributed to her worsening behavior without us realizing it. Honestly, I think that lack of interaction gave us a false sense of security that everything was fine, or at least stable. Some comments mentioned that my mother-in-law's new friends might have influenced her and encouraged her extreme behavior, and that theory makes a lot of sense. My mother-in-law, who had never held particularly strong political opinions, or at least hadn't shared them openly, started surrounding herself with people who seemed to share a very radical worldview. It's as if she had immersed herself in some sort of ideological bubble, one that only fueled her extreme behaviors further. This could explain her aggressive need to impose her beliefs at the party, as she seems to have been in an environment where any dissent was seen as unacceptable. However, as we've said before, this doesn't excuse her actions. Terrorizing her own grandson and his friends, in addition to assaulting one of the parents, is completely unacceptable and, frankly, hard to forgive. By the way, many people asked what happened to the father whom my mother-in-law physically assaulted. Well, as far as we know, he is still moving forward with his lawsuit and expects justice to be served. In fact, my wife is also hoping for legal action, as she's furious with her mother for what she did. My mother-in-law not only ruined what should have been a special day for our son, but she also shattered the trust and relationship my wife had with her. I can't deny that I also want some consequences to follow. While it's unpleasant to see a family member in legal trouble, I feel that what she did warrants some form of punishment, not just for what happened at the party, but because maybe that's the only way my mother-in-law will reflect on her behavior. What's worse for her is that there were many witnesses at the party. Not only were the parents of the kids there, but also some close family and friends. One of the guests even mentioned that they might have captured something on video, although we haven't seen that footage yet. I believe that could play an important role in the legal case, but either way, there's enough testimony from those present to make it difficult for my mother-in-law to deny or downplay what she did. There were also a few questions about what happened to the dresses my mother-in-law brought to the party. To be honest, it's not something I consider particularly important, but I understand the curiosity. After all the chaos, we just packed them back into her car, which she picked up after posting bail. When she came to retrieve them a few days after being released, we barely exchanged any words. It was clear she was very angry, but she showed no sign of remorse for what had happened. The friend who accompanied her, the same one who posted her bail, seemed even more upset with us. She's a much younger woman, probably in her 30s. It's been about 2 weeks since the incident, and although we hadn't spoken directly with my mother-in-law until recently, today she sent us a message. In that message, she expressed how upset she is about the kind of education we're giving our son. According to her, we're not showing him the world as it really is. We're locking him in a bubble. I was surprised to receive that message because, after what happened, I thought my mother-in-law might try to apologize, or at least explain what had happened. But instead, she seemed more concerned with pushing her ideas on us once again. What bothers me most about her message is that she seems to have completely forgotten that our son actually has a fairly clear understanding of the world around him. As I mentioned before, one of his best friends has 2 dads, and we've had open, honest conversations with him about it whenever he's had questions. We're not raising him in a bubble, nor are we shielding him from diversity. But what my mother-in-law doesn't understand is that showing the world to a child doesn't mean forcing them to do things they don't want to do, like she tried to do at the party. Forcing him to wear a dress is not a lesson in open-mindedness. It's just making him do something he doesn't want to do. Our son is curious and learning, but he's also a child, and he has the right to say no to something he doesn't feel comfortable with. It seems so obvious to me, but clearly it isn't to her. She must imagine we're raising him in an Amish bubble, learning math with an abacus. In the same message, my mother-in-law mentioned that she thinks it would be better if we kept our distance from her for a while, as she needs space to process what happened. My wife and I couldn't agree more. After everything that occurred, we also feel we need space, and although she was the one who suggested it, the truth is we had already decided to put some distance between us for the sake of our family. We don't want more confrontations, more awkward situations, and certainly don't want to expose our son to more drama. If she wants her space, we'll gladly give it to her, because honestly, we need ours too. Update 2. It's been 2 months since we last heard from my mother-in-law, and I can say that, so far, she's kept her promise to stay away from us. Honestly, we didn't expect her to, but ever since that last message, we've had 0 direct contact with her. However, even though we haven't spoken to her, news about my mother-in-law has reached us in a completely unexpected and surreal way. I don't even know where to begin because, on one hand, the situation is pretty serious, but there's also an irony to it that made me laugh despite everything. Recently, one of my mother-in-law's friends, those radical friends she's been hanging out with, made a social media post that spread like wildfire. Apparently, this friend was helping my mother-in-law clean out her basement, intending to use it for their gatherings or meetings, though I'm not entirely sure of the details. The interesting part is what they found during the cleanup, a box. But not just any box, a box that contained a rather peculiar collection, and here's where things get really strange. The box was filled with collectibles from World War II. At first glance, that might not seem like a big deal, right? Lots of people are interested in the history of that conflict, and collecting artifacts from that era is fairly common. But the important detail is that these collectibles were all from a certain side. You know what I'm referring to, and I don't want to get too specific because I'm not sure if the moderators of this forum will allow me to mention it without deleting the post. To avoid getting into trouble, let's just say that all the objects in the box were from a side that most people wouldn't exactly be proud to display in their collection. When my mother-in-law's friend found this, she apparently didn't take it well. According to her post, she was horrified and talked about how someone with those ideological leanings had managed to infiltrate their group. She called my mother-in-law a fascist and declared that she had cut all ties with her. The situation escalated quickly because not only did she make this story public on her social media, but she also shared my mother-in-law's information with other people. Since then, there's been a sort of online campaign against my mother-in-law, calling her everything from a sympathizer of that regime to much nastier names. I know that box must belong to my father-in-law, but I still find it strange. I'm not saying it's illegal to collect these kinds of objects, at least, as far as I know, it's not. But it's definitely unsettling for someone to be so focused on that side. I mean, it's one thing to be interested in World War II, but it's entirely different to collect artifacts so clearly associated with those ideologies. What baffles me the most is that, as far as I remember, my father-in-law was a completely normal person. He never showed any behavior or gave any signs of having any sort of leanings toward those ideas. In fact, he was kind, respectful, and I'd even say fairly liberal in many aspects. So, where did this come from? Is it possible that my mother-in-law started developing this interest after his death? It's really hard to understand. I haven't had the chance to sit down and talk to my wife in depth about all this yet because I literally just got home from work, and this whole thing seems so crazy and even funny that I couldn't wait to make this post. I already talked to my wife briefly on the phone when I found out, and I know she's in shock too, but we haven't had a serious conversation about what this all means, especially in terms of what it could reveal about her father. But if I find out more, I'll definitely be back here to update you all. Update 3. I know it's been a while since my last update, but this time, I have some significant developments to share that I'm sure many of you will find interesting. The most common question I've been getting since the last update has been about the trial of my son's friend's dad against my mother-in-law, and I can finally say we have a verdict. The ruling was in favor of the assaulted parent. My mother-in-law was found guilty of assault and now has to pay $500 in fines and complete 40 hours of community service. When I joke that nothing says, "Don't ruin your grandson's birthday party," like an arrest, I didn't think it would go this far. It's a good reminder that actions have consequences, and this outcome has brought some satisfaction, especially after all the chaos she caused on what should have been a special day for our son. I won't lie, while the fine isn't huge and the community service hours aren't many, the fact that she was legally held accountable for her actions feels like a small victory for everyone who was there that day. Now, what many of you have been asking most persistently, aside from the trial, is about the infamous World War II collectibles box that caused all the drama between my mother-in-law and her friends. After discussing it with my wife, I was finally able to get more details about the story behind the box and why it ended up in the basement gathering dust for years. What I found out has cleared up a lot of questions, and while it's not as dramatic as some might have imagined, it explains why the box existed in the first place. Apparently, my father-in-law was really into the history of that conflict, and over the years, he had been collecting items from various factions involved in the war. But, and this is important, he wasn't a collector focused on one specific side. No, he simply collected whatever he could find, regardless of which side it came from. However, over time, he lost interest in the collection. According to my wife, when she was about to go to college, he even tried selling parts of it, especially the more valuable pieces or those he didn't care much about. Here's where things get a bit tricky. It seems that most of the collection sold fairly quickly. The more neutral items, or even those from other sides, found buyers without much trouble. But when it came to selling the more controversial pieces, those from one particular side, you know which one, the situation was very different. My father-in-law discovered that those items were much harder to sell, either because the market for them was very limited, or because people simply didn't want to be associated with that kind of memorabilia. And when he finally did find someone interested in buying those items, they always turned out to be strange characters, the kind of people you wouldn't want to do business with. People who, in his words, seemed a little too enthusiastic about the wrong side of history. In the end, my father-in-law decided that it wasn't worth the risk or effort to keep trying to sell the remaining pieces. So instead of getting rid of them, he packed them up in a box and stored them in the basement. And there they stayed, forgotten for years, until my mother-in-law and her friends stumbled upon them during that infamous cleaning session. The funniest part of all this, or at least the ironic part that's made us laugh a little amid all the craziness, is that my father-in-law probably never would have imagined the uproar this box would cause years later. If he could see what's happening now, I'm sure he'd be laughing at the whole situation. At least now we know that my father-in-law didn't have any strange ideological leanings. He was simply a man who enjoyed history and collected things as a hobby. Because of the confusion and accusations that arose from that box, my mother-in-law's social life has taken quite a hit. From what mutual acquaintances have told us, many of those friends have distanced themselves from her. And while that doesn't surprise me after everything that's happened, it's clear that this situation has seriously affected her day-to-day life. For now, we'll continue to keep our distance, at least until we feel that she's learned something from all of this. But honestly, I don't have much hope that will happen anytime soon. Update 4. This update will be brief because, honestly, there's not much to report about my mother-in-law, at least not from our side. We still haven't had any direct contact with her, despite what we've been hearing recently about her supposed change. To give you some context, it seems my mother-in-law has returned to normal, or at least, as close to normal as she was before all this chaos began. However, we can't confirm that ourselves, since all this information is coming from what other people have told us. It's hard to imagine, considering everything that's happened, but at least that's what we've heard. It's now been more than a year since this whole story began, and in fact, we recently celebrated my son's birthday again. As expected, we didn't invite my mother-in-law. One of the parents of my son's friend, the one involved in the incident, even joked about whether she'd make a surprise appearance, but of course, that didn't happen. Despite her supposed change, we still haven't resumed any kind of relationship with her. The most surprising part is that, even though she's reportedly returned to her old self, she's never reached out to apologize. No phone call, no message, nothing. Some might think that now that she's back to being herself, she'd be more inclined to reflect on what she did and reach out to make amends. But it's been at least 4 months since we first started hearing about her change, and in all that time, she hasn't made any effort to contact us. If she hasn't done it by now, we believe it's probably because she doesn't want to. We don't know what's going through her mind, or if she has any plans for reconciliation. On our part, we're not sure how we'd react if she tried to reach out again. On one hand, we understand that she's been through a lot, and that the death of her husband was likely the trigger for many of her extreme behaviors. But on the other hand, the damage she caused and her lack of accountability or apology leaves us in a very difficult position. For us, this can only be resolved if she makes a sincere effort to fix things. But, at this point, we don't believe that's going to happen anytime soon. Update 5. It's been 2 years since my last update, and I know that's quite a long time. In my last post, I mentioned that my mother-in-law had supposedly changed, but we hadn't had any contact with her to confirm it. Well, that was the case until about 3 months ago, when she reached out to apologize. I don't want to bore you with too many details, but her explanation for why it took so long to apologize made sense. She told us that she didn't know how to cope with her husband's death, and all those radical changes she went through were her way of escaping the pain. Seeking extremes helped her avoid thinking about what she was going through, but at the same time, it made her drift further and further away from who she truly was. When she finally realized everything she had done and who she had become, she decided to seek professional help. She's been working through these issues in therapy for quite some time, but still felt too ashamed to reach out and apologize. It was only when she felt truly ready, about 3 months ago, that she contacted us. At first, both my wife and I had our doubts, I'll admit. But little by little, she has shown us that she really has changed, or at least, that she's returned to being the person we knew before. Recently, she even came to our son's birthday party, which was a huge step for everyone. The most awkward moment was when she came face to face with the father she assaulted at the previous party. Despite the tension, my mother-in-law sincerely apologized, and he accepted her apology. It was a key moment for us and a clear sign that she is committed to making amends for her mistakes. In short, I'm happy to say that we finally have our mother-in-law back, and she's been able to process and address her issues, especially her grief over the loss of her husband. That's all I wanted to share with you this time.